For everyone on the phone, we'll go ahead and get started in about 1 or 2 minutes.
Good morning. Good morning to everyone. Hello. Good morning. I'm Steve Beam, Chief of Milk and Dairy Food Safety. I want to welcome everyone to the first of the Animal Health and Food Safety Services Division Technical Seminar Series. Welcome to everyone that's dialing in remotely. See, I say dial, that's how old I am. None of you are dialing, but through the webinar. And the objective of this series has been to try and not only give you some professional enrichment, but also to serve as a means of making sure everyone understands the overall mission of CDFA, to better understand the roles of various programs, and to share from time to time some common technical scientific issues and policy matters that are out there, just to try to team build a bit. And so we're very fortunate to have, I think, a very good topic for the first seminar series. We have an excellent speaker. She's going to be introduced here in a moment. And just so you all know, there will be an opportunity for questions. The way we're going to handle that is we're going to do the chat portion of the webinar. So if you submit questions to the webinar, that was the alien mothership dialing. So we're going to handle the chat.
The Russians.
Yes, the Russians. The chat portion first, and then we're going to go to the phone line itself for questions, and then following all that, people in the room actually get a chance. So they'll be punished by actually being here by being last in the Q&A portion. But hopefully we'll be able to make all of this work. And so without any other, announcements, I'll go ahead and introduce our speaker. We're, again, very fortunate to have Dr. Alison Van Eenenam, and she is a cooperative extension specialist in the field of animal genomics and biotechnology in the Department of Animal Science at UC Davis. She received her Bachelor of Agricultural Science from the University of Melbourne in Australia. And then she attended UC Davis, where she earned both an MS in animal science and a PhD in genetics. In her position at UC Davis, her research and outreach program focuses on the use of animal genomics and biotechnology in livestock production systems, with projects that include the development of genomic approaches to select cattle that are less susceptible to disease, and the development of genome editing approaches for livestock. She also serves as the Cattle Genome Coordinator for USDA's National Animal Genome Research Support Program. She's a member of the National Academy of Sciences Engineering and Medicine Study Committee for Science Breakthroughs 2030, a strategy for food and agricultural research. She has given over 525 invited presentations to audiences globally, and she uses a variety of media to inform the general public about science and technology, including some controversial topics, of which I think the GMO topic today certainly falls into that category. She has, this is probably the best thing on her resume, she's appeared on the Dr. Oz Show, NPR, Science Friday, and the Intelligence Squared Debate Series. And recently, and she's going to, I think, mention this, she appeared in the IFT-funded documentary Food Evolution, which I think you can get. She's going to share some of that in terms of a trailer today. She's a very strong advocate for science, and she was the recipient of the 2014 Council for Agricultural Science and Technology Borley Communication Award, and in 2017 was elected as a Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And I share all that so you know that we get nothing but the best for you in our technical seminar series here. So today she is going to talk on a topic that certainly, again, falls into the controversial category among consumers, as well as policymakers and various stakeholders in the agricultural community. The title of her talk today is The GMO Debate, 20 Years of Animal Health and Livestock Feeding Studies. So with that, Dr. Van Eenenam, welcome, and thank you very much for being here today.
All right, thank you. I think I'll do that kind of unusual lighting in here, but I think that works best. I'll speak a little loud so the phone can pick me up. All right, thank you for inviting me here. And it's a little strange. I live about 20 miles from here, and I think this is the first time in my 20 years at Davis that I've actually been to this building. So I appreciate the invitation. And as was mentioned, I work in cattle breeding, and so my real interest is molecular genetics and cattle. But I kind of got involved in this topic because the controversy around GMOs in plants is really affecting the ability of cattle breeders and animal scientists more generally to use innovation. And we haven't been able to use genetic engineering at all in animal production systems due to this toxic debate. And living in California, as we all do, and having lived through Prop 37 and the propaganda that was out there trying to get people scared of this breeding method, really is what precipitated me to speak out more openly about it, because the cost of denying innovation to agriculture really affects the environmental footprint of our food production. And I think that that trade-off is not very well discussed. And certainly by groups promoting fear around this technology, there's not a blip or a mention of what the impact of their fear-mongering is on our agricultural production systems. And I think that science has a role to play there in trying to separate out the misinformation and also the consequences of forestalling access to these technologies in our ag production systems. And so I'm going to go through kind of a little background for those of you that maybe aren't aware of the breadth of the use of genetic engineering in feedstuffs for livestock, and then looking at the studies on the health of livestock that are consuming GE feed, because the major consumers globally of genetically engineered feed is our livestock populations. And so my lab manager and I have been involved in a couple of studies looking at the implications of that on the health of livestock, which is of relevance to this crowd, and then also on whether that affects the milk, meat or eggs from animals that have consumed GE feed, because there's an increasing push that I'm seeing from groups to label like milk non-GMO, and it's kind of this nonsensical thing because there is no such thing as quote-unquote GMO milk. And so we're getting this absence labeling, which tends to be propagated by people that are trying to sell you something more expensive that doesn't contain whatever it is that they're absence labeling for. And again, it's using misinformation and basically lying to consumers to try to increase their market share, which is a pretty disingenuous way to make a living, I think. So I guess I am not getting that to move. There we go. All right. So, you know, I think it's always amazing to me that people hate genetically modified organisms, but they're probably living with one. And, you know, I think that this image very clearly shows the amazing progress and, well, maybe progress, the amazing differences you can make if you set yourself to using just conventional selection to select the next parents of the next generation based on particular characteristics that you like. And I will leave it to your own thought processes that when you go home and have a good look at your dog tonight, whether there's any truth to this slide. But really, I think that, of course, we've been conventionally breeding our plant and animal species for many years, and that doesn't tend to be very controversial. But when we get to this one breeding method of genetic engineering, that's when everything blows up. And so I want to just kind of put it in context as to what it is I'm specifically speaking about. So GMO is a meaningless word. It's like beauty. It's in the eye of the beholder. It doesn't have a strict definition, and therefore it gets used by some people to refer to this, and by other people to refer more generally to the genetic modifications associated with conventional breeding. And I think that's kind of confusing, and unfortunately, GMO tends to be used in the common vernacular to mean this, which is genetic engineering. And basically what that's defined as, according to the USDA, is introducing, eliminating, or rearranging specific genes using modern molecular biotechnology, and quite often using the process called recombinant DNA. And basically what we're talking about is bringing in a gene, sometimes from a different kingdom, which is sometimes what really upsets people, into the genome of whatever species it is we want to express that gene, and then you have a novel characteristic in that particular organism. So, for example, the gene that makes human insulin was moved into bacteria to produce recombinant DNA insulin, and anyone that's type 1 diabetic probably is using recombinant insulin. We use it in many other aspects of food production. For example, cheese, separating cheese and whey, or curds and whey in cheese making, uses recombinant chymosin rather than taking that from the stomach of calves. We use recombinant DNA in a lot of human medicine and vaccinations. But when it comes to food, that's when the debate gets going. And it's kind of intriguing to me that people comfortably inject this into their body, but won't use it in food production. And so, well, what is it different there about food? And I think that that's part of the kind of the debate is food has this special place with people. And people, if you cast aspersions on the safety of food, then, and there's an alternative, kind of like if I held up two pieces of loaves of bread and I said, someone spat on that one. Well, why not put that one? Just in case. Might not be true, but I want to take that because I have that choice. And so I think that often the fearmongers will make aspersions about the safety of it. And so people, just to be safe, will take the other one, even though there's no validity to the claims that that loaf of bread got spat on. You have an option, or at least we do in the first world. Unfortunately, that's not true around the world, and I think this debate in the first world is having real-world implications on the ability of the developing world to access this technology, and that is a real problem. But even in the first world, there's been benefits associated with the use of the technology in our agricultural production systems. And so more generally, if we look at where genetic engineering specifically gets used, there was, of course, recombinant bovine somatotropin, which is no longer effectively used in the US market, due initially to fearmongering. Those of you that were around at that time, what's his name? Jeremy Rifkin was kind of leading the charge then, suggesting that the milk from cows that had been treated with recombinant bovine somatotropin had higher levels of IGF, and that was going to give you cancer, and a lot of unsubstantiated, untrue, lies, alternative facts, whatever you want to call it. And that led to some marketers putting a non-BST label on there, and they got a short-term market advantage because of the fearmongering. And then everybody, like a bunch of dominoes, swapped over to non-BST milk. And so now, and we at the university were using RBST until fairly recently, when our processor no longer will accept that milk. And so that technology effectively reduced the carbon footprint of a glass of milk about 7%. So now it's gone. So that short-term market advantage that those companies got for 3 or 4 or 5 years or however long it was is no longer available for anyone because nobody uses the technology anymore. And the technology is now gone. And so my question is, how did that help the sustainability of our dairy industry? Exactly. So now we just don't use the technology that had no health risks associated with it, according to the FDA, independent studies everywhere, but just fear-mongering by activist groups took it off the market. And it really worries me as a scientist working in agriculture. How many more of these technologies are we going to lose? What's next? Artificial insemination? It really, I think, is a concern. But there are currently no genetically engineered animals on the market. You are probably familiar with the fish, the fast-growing salmon, aquadvantage salmon. That has technically been approved by the FDA after almost 2-decade evaluation, but it's not allowed to be sold in the United States due to a rider on a budget bill passed by some legislatures from Alaska. I'll let you figure out why that might be. And so the only place in the world where you can buy genetically engineered food animal is Canada, where the fish is available. And after 20, 30 years after first developing genetically engineered animals, there's not a single food animal other than that fish available in one country in the globe. And that's where I think that this debate has had these real-world impacts, because we've developed disease with mastitis-resistant cows and pigs that don't produce as much phosphorus in their manure, the enviro pig. All of these applications are sitting on the shelf because there's just no investment in trying to bring these products to market with the current kind of toxic debate around this. So the only real place it gets used in any big way is in GM feed. And so that's where I will move now to look at what crops are genetically engineered in the US, and often you'll get this question. This is my little, I saw this on the internet, I love it. There's 10, and it's cats. CAP 3, so corn, cotton, canola, apples, what's the other one? Apples and alfalfa, papaya and potatoes, sugar, soy, and what was that? Strawberries? No, not strawberries. Squash. Yeah, squash. So not strawberries, not anything else that's not on this list. So almost, over 90% of corn, cotton, soy, and sugar beet, they're the big boys. And then a little bit of Arctic apples were recently approved. Innate potato, the non-browning potatoes and apples were approved. And then there's also papaya, canola, some squash, and increasing acreage of GE alfalfa. But other than that, nothing. So when you hear people say, I got celiac disease or I can't eat wheat anymore because it's GMO, not true. It's just not been genetically engineered. And so neither has any of this. So if people are looking to quote unquote avoid GMOs, then these are the feedstuffs that you can be certain are not genetically engineered. And all fruits and vegetables not listed above. So when you see that butterfly, the non-GMO butterfly on strawberries, that's just absolutely catering to the fear-mongering, right? Because there is no genetically modified strawberries. I've seen the butterfly on condoms, for heaven's sake, it's just insane. And I don't even want to know why that person was worried. I really don't. That's something that are best left not discussed. So, okay, 1996 was when the product first came on the market. So we've now had 20 years or 22 years experience. And I think that this graph shows this technology is liked by farmers because it's been widely adopted where they've had the access to use the technology. And what's interesting is there's now about 18 million farmers growing genetically engineered crops globally. But what the majority, or 90, about half of the hectareage or acreage is in the developing world, specifically India and China, where they're growing BT, insect-protected cotton. And the dramatic decrease in insecticide use in those two countries is phenomenal. And the health benefits to the farmers that are no longer spraying rather toxic insecticides without any protection quite often is one of the greatest success stories, I think, of modern agriculture. But good luck finding any word of that on the internet. And so it's the majority, 16.5 million farmers are in the developing world. It's also obviously growing in the industrial countries or the developed world and is a very big part of American agriculture, but it has been widely adopted. And as a result, if you look at the crops that have been grown, the big boy here is soy and corn. Where's all that soy and corn going? Down the gut of our livestock population. So these are the really big ones. Cotton, as I mentioned, is a biggie as well. And then canola and the rest of them are relatively small. So let's have a look at soy and cotton from a global perspective in terms of proportion of those crops that is genetically engineered. So this is a breakdown of corn and soy. That was 2012 data, but it's not changed a lot. The hashed mark here shows genetically engineered varieties and where they're grown globally. So here's the US, Brazil, South Africa, Canada, Argentina, Ukraine. About 35% of all corn acreage is genetically engineered. China's a big outlier there, so they haven't approved any GE corn at the current time. And then soybean, it's about 80% of all global soybean is grown in countries that allow genetic engineering, and it's Argentina, Brazil, and the USA. So let's have a look at the breakdown then of corn production. So here's corn production in blue. US is off the charts here. I had to actually break that bar to get it up to how much is actually produced here. So we're a very big corn producer. So is China, Brazil, Argentina, European Union. But then it's interesting to look. So here's where the exports are coming from. So US, a big exporter. So is Brazil. So is Argentina. They were the three biggies in terms of GE crops, as you will recall. And who's importing? Well, China a little bit, and the European Union a little bit. Let's have a look at soy. So soy production here, the big boys are Argentina, Brazil, and the United States. Therefore, they're the big exporters. You can see here, Argentina, Brazil, and the United States, exports in green. Who's buying? Look at China. It is a very, very big importer in this red bar here of soybeans in China and also the European Union. This is soybeans whole. If we look at soybean meal, where is that getting produced? You'll see that here, China is a very big producer of soybean meal. That's not because they're growing the soybean, they're importing the whole beans and then they're making meal. So that's where that's all coming from. So that's typically genetically engineered from Brazil, Argentina, and America. And then who's importing the heck out of soybean meal? European Union. Well, let's have a look at global trade then. As it relates to soybeans, maize, cotton, and canola, about 97% of soybean trade is genetically engineered, about 70% of corn, 70% of cotton and canola. And so if countries are importing a lot of soybeans, then they're importing a lot of genetically engineered products. And so you'll often hear people say the European Union doesn't grow genetically engineered crops. That's not exactly true. Spain has a little bit of corn, but more importantly, they are very big players in trade as it relates to genetically engineered soybeans. And where is that soybean going? Not to the human population, that's being imported to feed the livestock populations in Europe. And interestingly, they are having a hard time even maintaining a GMO-free supply chain for differentiated markets that want to have animals that haven't consumed genetically engineered soy. And so here is an article that says that they're just not able to do that because so much of global trade is genetically engineered. And interestingly, there is no mandatory labeling for milk, meat, and eggs from animals that consume genetically engineered feed in Europe. And so you have this perplexing situation where the European countries won't allow the cultivation of this crop and all of this precautionary principle, and we're not sure, and we're unclear about the safety. But that's kind of ignored when it comes to importing all this feed that they're feeding to their livestock populations. And so it's like, is it really a fear, or is this actually some more political maneuvering going on here? And I think clearly the scientists globally have a consensus around the safety of this product, and even the European Food Safety Authority. Scientists all say, we looked at the data and there's nothing there to see, there's no difference in the safety of these products. But the politics is what's stopping it getting planted in Europe. It's not the science per se. And so globally, the livestock populations have been eating predominantly GE feed for well over a decade. In fact, more like 20 years at this stage, because most of it goes to these animals. And this guy, Slachowski, has a number of studies where he looked at animal feeding studies and safety assessments of genetically modified plants. And he's actually in Europe. And his papers are very good. He's very thorough, and he looks at what's been going on there. And basically, we have a number of peer-reviewed, controlled safety studies, like hundreds, that show no difference between the health of animals that have eaten genetically engineered food or their the same line of that product without the inserted DNA, whether it's Roundup resistance or the BT product. But what occurred to me a few years ago was we have a very, very large field trial going on in the United States, because we have a very large number of livestock that have been eating soy and corn and alfalfa and canola for 20 years. And so if we look at the numbers of animals that we grow on a yearly basis, there's about 8.5 billion broilers go through processing every year in the United States. We've got tens of millions of dairy cows and beef cows and hogs. And so what we did, my lab manager and I, was had a look at what the health and safety of those animals look like, or what the health of those animals look like after the introduction of genetically engineered crops, and compared it to trends before the introduction of genetically engineered crops. And so we took this data point, which was basically the number of animals between 2000 and 2011 that have been consuming GM feed, and we went to the USDA databases and looked at things like mortality rates, post-mortem condemnation rates, growth rates, just health parameters that are collected on these really, really large data sets, and asked, was there any difference between the trends that we saw before the introduction of genetically engineered feed and the trends we saw after? And the answer to that question was no, there weren't any difference in the trends. And I think that kind of makes sense to me, because if we were seeing the animals being unhealthy and going off feed or getting big tumors or whatever, the livestock industry will be the first ones to notice that, especially with fast-growing broilers that get to market weight in, 39 days. If there was something wrong with them from a health perspective, you'd see a very clear evidence of that in the epidemiological trends associated with our livestock production system. We just haven't seen that. And so, you'll hear some people say it's an untested technology. I don't agree with that. I think that we've got a lot of data that shows that there's these large populations and control populations where we haven't seen any difference. And this is another Flashowski study where there's a summary of some of the animal feeding studies that have been done in dairy and beef and pigs and poultry and broilers and other poultry and fish. And basically the summary is there's been no unintended effects in the composition of the feed, with, ironically, the exception of BT insect-protected crops, which don't get attacked by insects as much, and consequently they have lower levels of mycotoxins, which is a good thing. And that's actually been a benefit as a result of protecting those crops from getting eaten by insects. And there was no significant differences in digestibility and poultry health, as well as no biologically relevant unintended effects in the performance of animals and composition of food from poultry origin. And it's really frustrating to me that scientists throughout the globe have done hundreds of studies looking at the safety of this feed as it's fed to animals. And yet one study that came out 3 weeks before Prop 37 from a scientist in France with 120 rats is sufficient for groups opposed to this technology to continuously raise the Seralini rat study as evidence that there is danger associated with consuming of genetically engineered feed. For those of you that aren't aware of this study basically took 120 Sprouse-Dorley rats and subdivided them into groups, some of which ate GMO feed, some of which got given glyphosate and then water, some of which had, or Roundup, some of which had both and then controls, and took them through for 2 years. And then at the end of the study said, oh my God, the ones that ate the GMO got these really big tumors. What wasn't noted was the fact that this strain of rat is well known to develop tumors at 2 years of age, and that there were large tumors also in the control group of rats that didn't receive either the GMO or the Roundup. And that picture never made it into the image. And these are the types of images, and any of you that have done animal care and use protocols in university would know damn well that that is absolute animal cruelty. You are not allowed to let animals get to that level of cancer development. And what has happened is that this study was retracted because it was just bad science. And yet, and when it came out, it resulted in a couple of African countries banning the import of all genetically engineered food. It resulted in these huge political ramifications from effectively a junk science study. It's very analogous to the Wakefield study as it relates to vaccines, and that was a discredited study that suggested there was an association between vaccines and autism. And look at the situation we have today. And I think that you see these very sensational studies get picked up by groups who ignore the weight of evidence and the opinion of every single scientific society in the world and use this study as their one data point called cherry picking to suggest that there's issues there. And unfortunately, we see more of this kind of, I would argue, politicization of science, where you're not having scientists accurately and objectively representing what the weight of evidence says around technologies. And with the internet, it really kind of takes off in a big way. So that study I just mentioned was published in 2014. So that was after the Seralini study came out, because I knew that what was shown in that study just didn't gel with my observations in the field. And more recently, we've done a study where we looked for dietary DNA and protein and glyphosate in the milk, meat, and eggs from animals that have consumed genetically engineered feed. And that, again, was being done due to this call for labeling of products. And so, and this is obvious to anyone with a biological background, but when you eat a banana, you digest the banana, the DNA of the banana and the proteins in the banana, that's known as food, and it gets broken down into nucleic acids and amino acids, and then it gets absorbed, and then it gets remade into yourself, right? That's kind of how digestion works. And somehow we have got this vision in people's brains that when they eat, quote unquote, a GMO, that I think there's an organism in there, kind of a scary little, I don't know, Pac-Man kind of a guy, that somehow is going to integrate that DNA or that recombinant DNA into their genome and make them Roundup ready or insect resistant or something. And it's like, why are we even having this discussion? It's kind of, is it just a lack of understanding? But let's just think about DNA consumption. So on average, we consume about 1 gram of DNA a day, none of which are human. I'm assuming none of you are cannibals. And it just gets digested, right? And so we don't even think about it. But if you ask the general public, do you want food that's got GMOs in it labeled, 90% say yes. More generally, if you ask them, do you want food that has DNA in it labeled, 90% say yes. So, we have a problem here. And so perhaps that's why we have such a hard time talking about this. But if you look at the amount of genetically engineered rDNA that a cow eats on average, they're consuming about 0.00042% of an average kind of ration for a cow would be made up of recombinant DNA. There's no data that suggests that gets digested in any way differently to the DNA that's in the other 3 billion base pairs that makes up the genomes of different species, or 3 billion in the case of cows and humans, but it depends on what you are. And basically, it's the intact DNA that gets consumed gets broken down in the gut. That's the whole concept behind human digestion. And there is differences in how herbivores, carnivores digest food, but about 85% of the nucleic acids that reach the small intestine in ruminants are down to the nucleotide level, A's and T's and C's and G's, that will then often get made into cow DNA. The rest of it is in very small fragments, but you don't have any coding regions that are, or entire genes that could encode a protein there. And what we did in this paper was we reviewed all of the papers that have been looking at DNA detection in milk, meat, and eggs that have been published globally. And there haven't been a lot because it's kind of a silly question to ask. And so, okay, 63 studies. And what they found was that they didn't find genetically engineered recombinant DNA or proteins in milk, meat, or eggs from animals that have eaten GE feed. And it's not possible to distinguish any differences in the nutritional profile following the consumption of GE feed because there's no compositional difference in the feed. And so therefore there's no compositional differences in the milk, meat, or eggs. So labeling animal products based on feed consumption is going to be effectively a process-based absence label. It's not going to tell you anything different about that milk, meat, and eggs because there is no difference between the products. And basically, the carefully controlled studies haven't found transgenic DNA in milk. Sometimes you get little tiny fragments of chloroplast sequences, but that's in conventional feed or genetically engineered feed. And there's one paper that came out of Turkey, I think, that identified fragments of recombinant DNA in milk samples. They didn't identify where these were powdered milk samples. And they were identified in both conventional and organic samples. So that particular paper, although it exists in the scientific literature, I have a little concern about because it doesn't seem like it agrees with the rest of the data. And neither recombinant or native DNA fragments are reliably or repeatedly detected in milk. And glyphosate is another one that I've seen coming up. And what I've seen happening is that groups that have been saying GMOs give you cancer are slowly shifting their game plan to say, oh, well, it's actually the pesticides that we're concerned about, the pesticides that get used with respect to genetically engineered organisms. And you're like, well, that depends on which one it is, right? So if you look at BT, you've got dramatic reduction in insecticide use. If you look at disease-resistant papaya, you don't use any chemicals. And so this kind of blanket blob of GMO, I don't think it does us any good because every application will have different implications. But obviously one of the big uses of genetically engineered technology in crop production is Roundup ready or herbicide resistant crops. And that we're well aware of that. It enables farmers to move from more toxic herbicides to less toxic herbicides. But as happens when you use one particular method of control, over time there's been the development of 12 species of resistant weeds at this time. But what I'm seeing more and more is a real effort by certain groups to suggest that glyphosate specifically is a really dangerous pesticide, and that it's associated with the development of cancer, specifically non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And there's a big lawsuit at the moment in the state of California trying to link those two together, despite the fact that if you look again at the weight of evidence around that particular herbicide, it is actually a relatively non-toxic herbicide that breaks down very quickly. And so one of the things that I'm seeing now is some groups pushing for an absence label for glyphosate. So in other words, our cows ate feed from crops that were never sprayed with glyphosate, which is used quite a lot in weed control, not only with GMO crops. It's used, for example, a lot in grape country. It's used in the production of drying down of certain non-GMO crops. It's used quite extensively because it is a relatively safe herbicide. So there has been some studies, and there's not a lot of literature on this. So this is all that there really is. So there was an intentional feeding of 40 to 400 mg per kg of glyphosate to animals in a FAO WHO report. And what they found was when you collected milk from cows intentionally fed glyphosate, no residues were detected in the milk because it's a soluble compound that goes out in the urine, basically gets peed out. It doesn't collect in the fat, and it doesn't go into the milk. And recently there's been 2 peer-reviewed studies, one done in, by Shelley McGuire up at Washington State, and one done by Germans, where they collected breast milk from human volunteers, and then they analyzed for the presence of glyphosate in the breast milk of these women using HPLC, so a sophisticated method that has good sensitivity, and they didn't find milk or glyphosate or the breakdown product AMPA in human milk or bovine milk samples. But there was this group called Mums Across America who basically had this a website where volunteers could send in breast milk samples, and they sent it off to a lab that did an ELISA test in these breast milk samples using methods that hadn't been validated in breast milk. As you well could understand, that's a complex matrix that has a lot of products in it, and you need to validate that your ELISA is going to accurately pick up glyphosate and not other things that might be in milk that would cross-react with your ELISA. And they came out with a very sensational piece on their website, not a peer-reviewed study, but basically guilty by internet, suggesting that there was levels of glyphosate in human breast milk. And there's a paper that came out that suggests that the bioaccumulation of high levels of glyphosate at the levels they were detected is biologically implausible when you compare it to the systemic and external doses estimated from urine biomonitoring, which is where glyphosate comes out, or from blood concentrations. And there's just no way that data is supported by the rates that women would be exposed to, or what you might predict would be present in breast milk, given the profile of glyphosate and its solubility. In other words, it's just, again, false data that's put out there to scare people, and especially nursing mothers. Can you think of a more vulnerable population in terms of trying to scare them? And of course, the message is, therefore, buy products that haven't been associated with glyphosate, i.e. those that don't use herbicides, and I'll let you guess where the marketing goes from there, because I don't want to denigrate any production system, but I do want to call out the marketers that are capitalizing on people's fear to try to increase their market share, because I think it's just wrong. So for me, let's focus on the real risks here. There are real risks in our food supply. From a public health perspective, you know, foodborne illness actually kills people every year. And it's, you know, I think about 3,000 or 4,000 deaths a year from foodborne illness. And there are actual toxins that we need to worry about in feed, like heavy metals and dioxin and mycotoxins. And they pose genuine risks to human health. And that's where we should be focusing our efforts if we're trying to improve the safety of our food supply, not on these unicorns that have no known health effects. And unfortunately, it seems like there, you know, a lot of attention gets given to this, and we've got this, you know, now this push to basically label products that don't have something in the first place with an absence label saying they don't have it. And it's like, why are we spending our money and time doing this? And so I want to go into labelling a little bit. Obviously, a super controversial issue. The mandatory GE labeling bill that passed in Washington is in the next week going to be released by the USDA as to what that labeling is going to look like. So you will well remember that was quite a controversial bill that passed, and there's now going to be smart labeling associated with products where you can scan a barcode and it will tell you whether it's genetically engineered products in your whatever it is that you're buying. And so what's unclear at the moment is whether the labeling is going to be all products derived from genetically engineered crops or just those that have remnant DNA fragments. In other words, oil, for example, wouldn't be labeled in that case because oils is oil. It doesn't have DNA or protein. Similar with sugar. Sugar is sucrose. It doesn't have DNA from sugar beet or sugar cane, depending where it came from. But the principles of food labeling, and I think the reason the FDA has been reticent to have mandatory labeling is that the labels cannot be false. They cannot be misleading. They must describe the basic nature of food. And the FDA cannot require labels to include information about production methods if there's no difference in the products resulting from those production methods. And typically the way that this has been addressed in the marketplace is if you are interested in a particular production method, whether it's grass-fed beef or cage-free hens or whatever, there's a differentiated market that services those consumers with a voluntary label and typically an increased price cost because it costs more to do whatever it is you're interested in the production system. That's basically been the approach that's been taken, and if you go into the supermarket, I think you can all vouch for the fact there's a lot of choice out there when you go into different production systems and different specialty labels. And so the mandatory requirements is dependent upon this, what is the material difference. So if my product contains peanuts, I have to have that on the label because that could kill somebody if they didn't know it was in there. I have to have my nutrition labels on there. But what else is mandatory? Well, it depends a little bit on this definition of material. So of substantial import of much consequence or directly relevant to a matter. Well, that's a little bit subjective as to what I consider to be material. And so some people might think the fact that it was GMO is a material difference, but the FDA science-based evaluation is there has to be a difference in the food product itself to mandate a label. And that is kind of what all this has been about. So the voluntary labeling is allowed so long as it's not false or misleading. And there are plenty of misleading labels in the market. Here's cholesterol-free vegetable oil. Well, I would surely hope that's cholesterol-free because cholesterol only comes in food products from animals. So this is clearly a misleading label that technically should not be allowed to be on that vegetable oil because there is no cholesterol there in the first place. But there are many voluntary labels exist that are both false and misleading. Here's my favorite. This is coffee. It's GMO-free. Well, that's good. There is no GMO coffee. Not a big surprise there. Pesticide-free. Really? And chemical-free? Really? No caffeine? That would be the worst coffee ever, right? And of course, caffeine is a really good pesticide. You can buy the grounds from Starbucks and that you can use it to spread in your garden. So this is quite a nasty compound. Having said that, I just drank some. Right, because I did a risk-benefit analysis and I thought the benefits was going to outweigh the risks. And I do that with alcohol quite a lot too. Even though that's a known carcinogen, like it is a known carcinogen, and yet I drank wine last night because the benefits outweighed the risks. And so now I think what we're seeing, you know, in the absence of any definition of what the heck sustainability is, we're getting all of these different labels out there that are appealing to different market segments. And choice is great. You know, knock yourself out. If you want to have kosher or grass-fed or whatever, those products are out there. But, you know, there are many production methods that are used in animal production systems that different consumers might be interested in knowing about. And this is quite honestly, this could be a piece of meat in Safeway right now. And the question is, which production processes should be singled out from mandatory right-to-know labeling? And so I want to know if my cow was bred using AI. I want to know if it got a pink eye vaccination. I want to know, you know, it's like there's no end to what someone might want to know, but at what cost do you have this right-to-know process-based labeling? And it sounds horrible to say, I'm against someone's right to know, but I guess the right to know also comes with the right or the requirements to learn. You know, and I think that you don't have a right to know about something that doesn't affect the safety of the food. And typically how that's been handled in the marketplace is this voluntary labeling. And when you start mandating it, it has these huge knock-on effects in terms of entire supply chain traceability to know whether the oil in your muffin came from a genetically engineered crop or not, because you can't test for it. So you're going to have to, you know, it's going to be incredibly complex to have labeling for products that are produced using genetic engineering. And in my opinion, you know, there's a special place in hell that's reserved for these pandering marketers that are selling, you know, non-GMO strawberries or gluten-free non-GMO water. What does that even mean? And I just think, you know, there's a real market push at the moment to try to capitalize on this, and it really doesn't mean anything. And so, well, who cares? You know, let people do that. I think the problem is that, you know, what public health benefits do we have from these labels? Are we scaring people away from safe technology? As it relates to the labeling of animal products, to date, including the federal administration, the proposed mandatory GE labeling laws have excluded products from animal-fed GE feed. Well, as the papers show, that's not a silly thing because there's no difference in the products from animals that are eaten GE feed. And they also have excluded processing aids. But if you consider that, you know, almost all the animals in the United States, unless they're in a production system that doesn't allow genetically engineered feed, are going to be eating genetically engineered feed, it would be incredibly complicated to track animals, make sure they never had, you know, a bale of hay that came from GE alfalfa. Would be very complicated and expensive, and there would be absolutely zero human health benefits. So that's a lot of money to spend for what benefit, I guess I ask. But I see groups now starting up the chant, you know, targeting Chobani and Starbucks, use, you know, non-GMO milk. And what does that even mean? And, you know, I don't believe everything you read on the internet just because there's a picture with a quote next to it. And I really love that little meme because I think it kind of captures my attitude. But I think what concerns me is that the ignoring the benefits that are being associated with GMOs. And there is literature out there, this is one paper, there's many papers out there, that show that the adoption globally of genetically engineered crop varieties has reduced the overall global pesticide spray about 8.1%, specifically their insecticides, and it's allowed the substitution of a relatively safe herbicide for more toxic herbicides. And if you look at that overall, it's about a 20% global reduction in pesticide use in agriculture. Why are the environmental groups not singing the praises of a technology that has that kind of a global impact? And more generally, it's facilitated the use of no-till farming, which is associated with less turnover of soil and less tillage and you know, gas to drive the tractor around the field, both of which have these huge greenhouse gas implications and equivalent to taking off about 12 million cars from the road. So when I see someone saying, I want to have a butterfly on my product, I'm saying, what is that butterfly saying to you? And, you know, here's Chloe Stornetter, bless their heart, putting the non-GMO butterfly on milk. And basically what that says to me is we ignore science and we're going to preclude access to a pesticide-reducing technology, and we choose to raise the emissions per glass of milk for profit. That's what that butterfly symbol means to me. And I think we need to call out a little bit more honestly the true impact of this absence labeling, because it's demonizing a technology that has had very positive beneficial impacts on the environmental footprint of our food production systems. And that story is not getting out there. The story that's getting out there is the fear and disinformation around this technology. And I think that, you know, preying on a parent's instinctive desire to protect the health of their children by using lies to scare them into paying more money for absence-labeled food, or even worse, to not eat fresh fruits and veggies because of trumped-up fears around GMOs and pesticides, is the most unethical and disingenuous way to increase market share imaginable. And California is ground zero for this fear-mongering, I think. And that's the reason that I was involved with the production of Food Evolution, which is, for those of you that haven't seen it, is a movie that's available on Hulu. And I think I'm going to play a little clip. It's narrated by Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's a well-known science communicator. You may know he narrated Cosmos. You might wonder why an astrophysicist was the narrator on a movie about GMO, because he's a defender of science. And I think that is what is at issue here, is not GMOs, but the defense of science and basing our decisions on objective evidence. And that's really what the heart of this movie is about, is how to make people make decisions and how do we get it so wrong.
The survival of our species has always depended on advances in agriculture.
Climate change is going to scramble this "how are we going to feed the world" debate.
This is all about companies.
This is about money. This is about power.
It's much easier to sell fear than it is science. If you don't have food, then you're going to kill. You're going to kill someone.
So, how do we make the most informed decisions about how we feed ourselves?
The three most terrifying letters in the English language are GMO. I wondered how many people really know what they are.
I don't know.
I know it's bad.
Genetic engineering is a modern form of breeding.
The goal is to add useful traits into food.
I am concerned about some of the health issues related to GMOs.
More cold, autism, susceptibility to hepatitis,
Cancer,
HIV. There's absolutely no proof to the health hazard.
Never trust one opinion. You look at the consensus of experts.
I don't think that genetically modified organisms are dangerous.
You're either going to be GMO or you're going to be organic. They cannot coexist.
If this is an organic planet we're going towards, you would see all the rainforests destroyed just to feed the current population.
This is something I'm going to look into.
Some people can say wild and crazy things.
I trust the social media more than most medical doctors, more than the CDC, more than the FDA, more than the EPA. I don't need a scientific study.
Things like that.
We humans are wired to make our minds up, and that's it.
We make decisions based on our gut. When was the last time you changed your mind?
Our intentions were honourable. We were trying to protect the future of the planet and the health of our children. It begs the question, how do you know that GMOs are the enemy? What if we got it wrong?
The good thing about science is that it's true whether or not you believe in it. You see, that's the...
So for those of you that haven't seen Food Evolution, I'd encourage you to do so. It's free on Hulu, and if you don't know what that is, ask the kids. Otherwise, you can pay for it to watch it on Google Play or iTunes or anything like that. And so, if you're interested, also Dr. Emma, who's quite a big feature in the movie, is coming to Davis in a couple of weeks for we're having a whole day session on science communication at Davis. It's open to the public. If you're interested in coming along, I can send some information to share with you guys. So that's all I have for you. I tried to leave lots of time for questions, and so I'm happy to open it up, but I'm used to getting spicy questions, so don't hold back.
We're going to go to the chat first, so I guess I'll leave Your technical people here to read the question.
Do you want to read it? Go ahead. Do it loud.
Okay. Jennifer McDougall said, besides what Dr. Van, I can't pronounce the last name, is doing, are there any other organizations that are attempting to improve public perspectives regarding GM food?
So I think the question was, what other efforts are there to alter this discourse from this toxic environment we're in? And that's a really good question. And one of the problems I think we have is that whose job is it? And so if the companies do it, the outreach, then people are like, oh, well, they're a company, you know, I don't believe anything a large multinational corporation does, let alone Monsanto, God forbid. They must be bad, so I'm not going to listen to them. And then the academic scientists are typically, you know, doing what they do, which is, you know, study and teach grad students and lecture. And so there's really not an obvious group to defend the science around this technology. And I think there's a growing group of science communicators that are interested in trying to correct this debate and are stepping into the fray a little bit. And so there are some different efforts to kind of reset this disinformation campaign. But the groups that are opposed to this technology now are fairly large business segments, and they fund groups, entire groups that put out this misinformation. And so it's a little bit of an unlevel playing field because the industry that's basically profiting from this fear-mongering, they do have money to invest and nobody seems to question their motives. And yet if the company that makes GMOs does it, everyone questions their motives. And any scientist that talks about this, I mean, basically what I told you today is scientific consensus of what the data says. You don't need to pay scientists to say what the scientific consensus is. Typically, rogue scientists tend to be paid by groups and putting out information that doesn't agree with what the scientific weight of evidence says. And so I think we have a real problem in that there's really no one whose obvious job it is to defend this technology. And so I think there's been a vacuum of objective evidence. It happened with the vaccine debate too. And I think you see more and more people using Twitter and stepping into the social fray, and it's quite often a bit of a hostile place. But I think if we want to continue to make decisions based on objective evidence, that it's all of our jobs to stand up and defend science when it's getting manipulated like this.
Isn't that why the codex is to uphold science and help policy?
Right. I mean, so the codex is part of being in that is that you have to have your trade decisions based on scientifically defensible. It can't just be trade protectionism. Although I don't know if that's been 100% successful. I think we can't import hormone-treated meat into the EU and GMOs. You know, there's a lot of politics that get infused into this, I think would be a fair way to put it. And it's you know, science also has a communication problem because typically, you know, scientists will give a very dry lecture, they don't appeal to people's values, they don't storytell in a narrative way. And if you have someone that's telling you that, you know, this evil company is trying to poison your kids and they're there to help you, and then you have a scientist sprouting a bunch of facts, it's not a fair playing field because I'm still focusing on the fact that this lady just said, my kids are going to get cancer, and I'm sorry, scientists, but you didn't capture me with your data reassuring me. I'm much more scared by and so fear is really hard to overcome with actual data. And I mean, look at the vaccine discussion, right? I mean, we've got actual parents not vaccinating their children based on misinformation. And I'm like, okay, don't eat GMOs. It doesn't really matter. It's not going to hurt you one way or the other. But here you've got people making choices not to vaccinate their kids with very real potential health consequences for their own children. And if we can't get that right, then, you know, this one becomes less important relative to that one. And so it's obviously a bigger issue. And this whole alternative facts, you know, it came up in the election. We've been dealing with this for a long time, I would argue, in agriculture. And it's really the narrative around agriculture amongst urban people is like not at all how agriculture works. And I think it's a real issue trying to get that right as well. Yep.
Another one, or should we go?
I don't think
Yeah, no more questions. Yeah. There was a comment from somebody that they wanted to clone you, so that.
Well, okay. I'd be worried about epigenetic reprogramming.
Can we unmute the phone for people that want to come in?
The phone is.
Yeah, just unmute everyone.
Yeah.
So everyone's lines have been unmuted, so you can call your questions in.
Yeah, I had a question. This is Dr. Burr. One of the concerns I've been hearing is the use of neonicotinoids that have been incorporated into these GMO corn and soybean crops, and because they emit pesticides on a daily basis, if you have a crop of almonds or some other fruit-bearing tree that requires pollinators, it's going to be affecting the pollinators, and the bee growers or the beekeepers that I know are still losing 50 to 60% of their bees from colony collapse, and they believe that a big factor is these neonicotinoids.
So, thanks for your question. This one is another one that I think is out of balance with where the data is on the effect of neonics on bees. And I think if you look at the data around bees, that neonics are not associated with the colony collapse. I think there's mites and other things there. And unfortunately, this one is kind of getting conflated with genetic engineering, and it's a coating on the seeds that protects them from, I don't know, whatever it protects them from, that is not necessarily a GE issue. So, you know, I don't know, disease-resistant papaya got nothing to do with neonicotinoids. So there may be an effect there. I guess this is not my area of expertise, but I find a lot with this particular topic that we'll be talking about genetic engineering, and then it'll be whack-a-mole will start, and it'll be like, well, I don't like, you know, multinational controls, or I don't like neonicotinoids, or I don't like this and that. And it's like, well, okay, well, that's fine, but that's a different topic. And whether bee colony collapse is associated with neonics and whether neonics are having any impact on that is a legitimate topic for discussion. It's certainly not in my ball of wax because I'm an animal breeder. And it's also not a GMO thing. It's the seed protection that's on the seeds. And so I would refer you in that regard to someone whose expertise is that particular area, because that's not one that I'm familiar with.
Did you get my email about me?
But what I have read of it suggests that
probably
sorry,
or something. How we're gonna
go ahead.
Yeah, or not a conference call, but just have a meeting. Yeah.
Just a reminder that all the phones are unmuted, so we're hearing everything you're saying.
Does anyone have a question from the phone?
They want 75 samples over the course.
Okay.
Let's go ahead and just mute.
Okay.
Or muted.
Yeah.
Any questions in the room?
Yes.
Dr. Stevens.
It strikes me that, you know, the thing that we're identifying as a fixable problem is the communication side of people who understand science and need to communicate that to the public at large and what have you. But it seems to me that a potentially larger problem is the audience side of this, is that they are not prepared to, as that one person said, accept the fact that science needs anything. They're just as happy to ignore that after you tell them. And I'm wondering, it seems to me to be more of a failure of the educational system, perhaps related to homeschooling kind of isolationism. Seriously, and I have a very unhappy gut feeling about how to address that side of it. And you could talk the truth all you want to a group of people who are not prepared to hear you, and you've gotten nowhere. And so there seems to be, you know, an increasing total denial of authority in science. And again, you can speak the truth to these people, and it bounces right up. They don't believe you.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I think, in my experience with this particular topic, is that, and I heard this analogy by someone, there's a normal distribution curve, and there's the polar bears. The polar bears that are polar opposites of each other, and one lot is very gung-ho, and this is the best technology ever, And then over here, there's the polar bears that are like, this is the worst technology ever. It's going to kill your kids. And then in the middle, there's the penguins. And they're the undecided people who listen to the polar bears, and then they hear something else that they're kind of going backwards and forwards. And they're the ones you want to reach because they haven't made their decision yet. And I think there's an example in the movie where we did a debate in New York City, like right in the middle of New York City, about GMOs. It's the Intelligence Squared debate series. And I thought, good luck. You know, I just thought we had no chance there. But in that particular debate, it was moderated by a very strong moderator who only allowed science to be discussed. So he didn't allow any bullshit. And all four of the debaters were scientists. And so you couldn't say that, you know, papayas will give you AIDS. It just wasn't that discussion. And when you are actually able to kind of keep within those guideposts and have this discussion, the 40% of the audience that hadn't made up their mind yet, by the end of the movie, the debate, had switched over to being supportive of the genetic engineering. And so I think, and I found that with the movie screening also, is that just people, most people, this is not a top of mind concern. Most people don't wake up in the morning wondering what breeding methods are being used to produce their food. And so I think that those reaching that middle group, or you know, we spend a lot of time focusing on Food Babe and Dr. Oz, but the middle group is who we really want to get to. And I think those ones actually, you know, most people are in your day-to-day interactions are sensible people, but I do agree that there's a distrust of science and expertise at the moment. I think we've seen that play out in Brexit. We've seen it play out in our politics here. We see it play out in vaccinations and pasteurization and you know, all sorts of issues. And so what can we do to change that? And I don't know. I mean, that's why we're in the situation we're in right now. But I do think there's a need to defend some of these technologies, or we are going to have lose access to innovation in our agricultural production systems. We already have lost access to innovation, some innovation. I think I saw your hand next. Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about your interview with Dr. Oz? Did he seem to have some sort of a hidden agenda, or what was your communication with him off camera?
You know, it kind of annoys me. Like I've spent my entire life, you know, I got my PhD, and you know, a member of the National AAAS, and my claim to fame is I was on the Dr. Oz show, which actually requires no skill at all, right? In fact, most of the people are crazy people, right? And so being on there is not a badge of honor. But that was, it was for us. Well, it was 3 weeks before Prop 37, and his wife is narrator on Jeffrey Smith's movie that says GMOs will, you know, give you AIDS or whatever. And so he's clearly not a disinterested character in this. And so he had Jeffrey Smith, who's a swing dancer, who goes around the world telling people that GMOs will give you AIDS. Him and discussing the Seralini rat study. So those great big rat tumor pictures were in the backdrop, right? And so he had Martina McLaughlin, who is a plant biologist at Davis, against there. And then I was in a second section on labeling with Gary Hirschberg from Stonyfield Organic Farms or whatever. And so what was interesting was, well, a number of different things were very interesting, but in my case, I had to talk about the cost of labeling, and I was asked to fly back there, so I flew back there. And then when I got into the audience, so it was 2 chairs set up on the stadium, you know, with Dr. Oz and Gary. And then I was asked to sit down in this chair in the audience and call out my questions like I was some random person that walked in from the crowd. And I'm like, no, that's silly. I want to sit up on the stage so we can have, like, you know, grown up talk about this. And Gary Hirschberg apparently said he didn't want to sit on the same stage as a scientist. And I did not know we were contagious. I wish we were contagious. So it ended up being that I was allowed to sit on the stage, but I had to kind of lurk behind the camera while Oz and Gary, who are good friends, had this lovely chat. And, you know, Gary's sitting there and saying, well, it's not a big deal. I relabel my yogurt containers every spring, different colors. And I'm sitting there going, what has that got to do with mandatory process-based labeling for genetically engineered foods? Like, that's a little bit different. And he's like, it doesn't cost anything. And we just change the color. It was just insane. And then Dr. Oz, who never introduced himself to me, and this, you will appreciate this, never asked me how to say my name. My name is not like something you look at and go, oh, that's Smith, I've got it covered. And I thought that was a little bit telling, right? And so anyway, he botched the name as I came in there, and sat down, and then, as I had been trained to do, responded to his questions with one big run-on long sentence that there was no real good editing point to take out the entire sentence, and actually got into a discussion backwards and forwards with Gary and kind of called out that, you know, he was being disingenuous to compare the costs to labeling. And then I went into why it was going to be expensive, and it went on for quite a long time, and it all got into what went out to the public, which was great. But it's the only segment of the Dr. Oz show you will not find on his site on the internet, because let's just say Gary's body language was not exactly giving me a lot of love. And so since that time, I haven't been asked back, shockingly. But, you know, you've got a doctor who's actually a doctor. He's on Columbia's faculty. I think he's like a surgeon or something. This is not a person that's unaware of scientific evidence. And he introduces a swing dance instructor on to be the person representing the Seralini rat study, and discusses that rat study with those great big tumors 3 weeks before the proposition labeling in California. None of that is an accident, right? The release of that study, and then what happened. And so when he first asked scientists to go on that show, my friend Pam Ronald had been on it a few years before, and he absolutely ramrodded her with a bunch of incorrect information, and it ended up that if you saw that episode, it reflected very badly on her, and it wasn't, you know, reflective of the objective truth. And so there was a bit of hesitation between Martina and I as to whether we should even go on this show, because he does not, he edits things. And so when Martina did her thing, Seralini, or what's his name, Jeffrey Smith, said whatever he was going to say. And then Martina wasn't allowed to sit on the stage with him either. So she got interviewed separately later, and she responded to what he said. And then when she got done, Dr. Oz, sorry ladies, but he leans over, he goes, oh, you did such a good job. I so like women scientists. And so Martina was like, whatever that means. And then she left, and then they retaped the interview with Smith, and he brought up other points that she had not addressed because he hadn't said them. And then when he spliced together the thing, it kind of seemed like she wasn't really addressing the points that he brought up. And so that type, you have no control over that kind of bullshit, right? And so it was really, it was very disheartening, because that at the time was the #1 talk show in the US. However, since he got torn down by Congress for his information, his ratings have dropped quite precipitously. So there is a God. Yes. I'm really glad you brought up the Clover Cornell label. You should have seen it before we had them make a lot of changes, because it actually said non-GMO milk. It was big. It was big. It was wow. It was right in the middle. Anyway, so like the point that I want to bring up is they've been successfully cloning holocaust. Yep. And beautiful example of Quadratero, which is the world's best holocaust axolotl. So hopefully when we see like beautiful large animals like that getting cloned, maybe that will send a more positive message about what we're doing. Yeah. That's the point I'm hoping to do. Yeah, well, and I don't know if you saw Barbara Streisand cloned her dog too the other day, and so it's kind of interesting watching the back and forth on Twitter around that. I mean, who gives this rat's ass, right? I mean, it's like, and so, but there's, you know, people like, well, she should have adopted a dog from a shelter and stuff, and you're kind of like, you know, really? That's where we've come? But no, the Polo Pony, there was a nice article in, whatever it was, MIT Review, but, you know, cloning is used, I wouldn't say routinely, but it's used a fair bit in different species for, especially the elite breeding stock in the dairy industry. That's used after genomic selection of embryos, and they will just clone the line that has the best, and then they don't have to bring all the other animals to life. So it gets used a little bit. People don't know that it's happening, but people don't know a lot of things. They don't know, you know, I don't think they know a lot about our agricultural production systems, and it's not necessarily because we're hiding it, but they've never cared up until this point. And it's always kind of perplexing to me to know, well, exactly what is it you would like to know, like everything that was on that steak, or what is it that's important to know? And I think most people just want to be comfortable in the fact that the animals are treated humanely and that the food is safe. I mean, I think that's common shared values, and then other people will have their own little things that they want. But the one that worries me at the moment is this new initiative coming down the pipe. I think it's called the animal, it's something that you couldn't vote against it because you would be heartless if you did, but you know, being nice to animals initiative. But it's basically mandating cage-free eggs in California, and anyone that supplies California. And I don't know, the poorest person collecting signatures at the Davis Farmers Market picked the wrong person when they asked me. I think they're still recovering. But if you look at the data around, so we're well aware of Proposition 2, and I forget what proposition this one's going to be, but the data on cage-free versus quote-unquote furnished cages is quite clear in terms of hen welfare. The worst hen welfare in this objective study that was done by the Sustainable Egg Coalition, which included, ironically, McDonald's, what worst welfare was the cage-free systems. And now McDonald's, for example, has committed to that. And from a sustainability perspective, worst animal welfare, worst environmental footprint, most expensive. Okay, so we're going, it's rare to get all three components of sustainability going in the same direction. They're going the wrong direction, though, in all three components of sustainability. How that can be called a sustainability decision by McDonald's, you know, is just insane. And so if you look at what happened to our chicken population, you guys would be well aware of this since Prop 2 went into effect. We've about halved our chicken population to basically make more room in the cages. I would predict another halving if we go to cage-free. And our egg consumption hasn't gone down. We're just bringing in eggs from other states. We're basically just tying the hands of our farmers behind their backs. And nobody, if you go to the supermarket, I went there the day before Christmas, and there was California compliant eggs, or CFS or whatever it is, that was empty. And then there was cage-free and pasture-raised and a few other different things. There was still plenty of eggs left there. And so if the consumer wanted the cage-free, they already have that option. But I guarantee that thing will pass, because I forget what it's called, but it's, you know, worded in such a way that to vote against it would be like, you know, being against motherhood and apple pie. But the data says that what is being suggested is going to be worse in all three aspects of sustainability. And as a consumer in California, I will no longer have a choice to vote with my principles and vote for the system that agrees with my sustainability choices. And that, to me, I think is just unfair to have one segment dictate to everybody else what their choices have to be. And so I think we'll have a real issue with that one. Yeah.
Along those lines, I just wanted to, you reminded me of something, which is when you deal with both sides of this in various forums in terms of consumer opinion and scientific, you know, knowledge and data, science-based decisions, and there are some startups in California where they're using biotechnology to produce food and in new and novel ways. And one of those is a startup in the Bay Area where they are genetically modifying yeast to produce dairy protein. So it's actual cow whey protein, and they're going to fix it to similar to a fermentation process, and they're marketing it as animal-free dairy, essentially. They haven't started yet, but that's envisioned down the road. There are also companies that are growing beef in a dish through cell culture systems. So I'm just wondering, in your experience, how will those that are in the animal welfare community embrace or change their opinion of technology like this when it seems to come up against their own mission overall? Yeah, well, I mean, there's some funny parallels there, but the Impossible Burger is one that's being produced that's using plant-based proteins, but they have a genetically engineered heme that's added to it to give it that blood flavor. And that's been really interesting watching that. And ironically, they were getting harassed or attacked, the company, for having GMO ingredients. And the person must not have known me very well, called from Impossible Food Burgers to ask me to defend their use of GMOs in their product. And if you go to their website, they absolutely throw animal agriculture under the bus and use like really bad data to support that this is a better sustainable system. And I think, you know, these alternative sources of meat
It's fine. Let's have a look at the sustainability implications and the life cycle analysis, though, because, you know, there's a pretty sweet deal that we got going on with ruminants where basically sun makes the grass grows and grass gets eaten by ruminants and they turn that into food. That's sunlight to cow. There's a little bit of grain in the last 60 days, but that's a pretty efficient system. And if you've got to grow cell cultures in lights and everything, what is the actual electricity footprint and the actual life cycle analysis of that product? And I think until we have that data, it's hard to say whether that is or is not a more sustainable system. And I think more generally, you know, there's more to animals than food. And I think that the way that these companies are marketing these products is kind of ignores the huge role that animals play in a global agricultural system. Let's just say we got rid of all the animals in America. There was a paper just came out on that, and it looked at what the actual environmental implications were. It's about a 6% drop in greenhouse gas emissions, but huge nutritional absences or deficiencies in the overall US diet if we went 100% just got rid of all the animals. And where would the manure or where would the, I guess more generally, that the fertilizer for all of these crops come from? And a lot of these systems, well, a lot of these systems are, especially in systems that don't allow inorganic fertilizers, i.e. you have to use shit, are 100% reliant on the concentrated animal feeding facilities to have a place where you can collect the manure and go take it to your place. So if we do away with our concentrated animal feeding facilities, where is the fertilizer for these systems that don't allow inorganic fertilizer going to come from?
Yeah, there are several questions on the chat.
Okay.
You want to?
We're getting some questions from the internet.
Felicia Paul said, I think a lot of concern when it comes to GMO advanced technology, vaccines in general, is the fact that older generations and ancestors got along fine without them. How did you address this?
Oh my gosh, I think that person didn't live long ago because I think previous generations just died because they got polio. And I think if you look at our life expectancy now, it's way better than previous generations. So I think that's actually not supported by the data. And it is intriguing to me. We live in a society that has the lowest rates of diseases and the longest lifespan, and yet somehow people think we're going backwards. And how is it that so much is going right, and yet there's this kind of pessimism that everything's wrong? And so I agree that part of the vaccine concern is people have never seen kids with the allergy or with the diseases that these vaccines protect you against. And thank God, you know, and I just, it's tragic when you see these people, and it happens with unpasteurized milk too, where they haven't understood the risks, and then they've given their kids something and they've got sick or they've got the disease, and then the parents are horrified that they made that choice that hurt their child. And, you know, so everyone with a scientific training is kind of going, but that's what, you know, that's what we told you. And like, you know, how can you not know that with so much data available on the internet with the click of a button? How did you choose to ignore, you know, the World Health Organization and go with, you know, Food Babe or that lady? You know, it's this, people are making decisions with their guts rather than their brains, and that's the real issue.
Yeah, so Emmanuel Carrasco, I think, Teneco, says, coming from a developing country where food security issues are very critical, I find this presentation very interesting and illuminating. Often the penetration of farming systems by improved varieties have been resisted because of the fallacious impression that anything that is manipulated in the laboratory is dangerous. We forget that selection and crossbreeding for good production traits like growth rate, milk production have been going on for years, and that is actually genetic modification. I will appreciate this message going far to academics and policymakers in such places that need rapid solutions to food security problems.
I don't disagree. I mean, I think breeding is, you know, one of the greatest success story ever in terms of sustainability. I think if you look at, you know, a glass of milk today is a third of the environmental footprint it was in the 50s. And so that's what, I'll give a little bit of credit to the vets and the nutritionists, but about half of that's genetic. And so it's, once you've improved it genetically, it's transferred on from generation to generation. And so unfortunately, to his point around food insecurity, these, the worried West, as I call them, their concerns are impacting those countries from actually having access to innovation. And in the movie, we talk about this disease-resistant banana in Uganda, that basically they can't get to the farmers because of the first world concerns around GMOs, and that's stopping the subsistence farmers from having access to a wilt-resistant banana. And there's just something morally wrong about that, and very frustrating. And that's developed by the scientists in Uganda for Ugandan subsistence farmers. So there's no Monsanto, there's no, there's nothing there except breeders trying to solve their local problems in their local varieties. And that, to me, is a story that just challenges dogma around GMOs, because it's got nothing to do with pesticides, nothing to do with large multinational corporations. It's just scientists trying to solve agricultural problems.
That was the last question.
Yeah, I think there was, did you have a question?
You've had your hand up a couple times, yeah.
Actually, please.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, don't want to get as many people as possible free.
Sorry. So my question is more related to marketing of science, I guess. This push for educating people on good science, because as a scientist, you're trained to communicate very truthfully. You're only talking about exactly what you've tested. So my question is more, we say that we should be communicating, we should sort of push this responsibility off someone, some organization, to communicate the consequences of not using GMO. But as as teachers, how do you incorporate this in educating graduate students so that you're communicating more effectively to a broader population?
Right. Well, I think part of science communication is, yes, you have to be objective, but it doesn't mean you have to be dispassionate. And I think typically passion isn't advocated in scientific communications. God knows we've all sat through lectures where that's been on demonstration. But we are allowed to be passionate about science. And so I think that's where the difference lies. And I think I have like the weirdest life, because I work with agriculture, beef cattle production. And so almost all my clientele are hardcore Republicans. And then I live in Davis, and all my friends are left-leaning liberals. And I get so annoyed at both of them, and so I just recently gave a talk about this topic to a cattle producer who came up at the end. He goes, "Yeah, that was a good presentation, but I didn't like the way you framed it about greenhouse gases, because we all know that's just not happening." And I'm like, okay, so you will accept the scientific consensus on the safety of GMOs, but you're going to ignore it on climate change. All right, and then I'll go to my greeny friends in Davis, and we'll be, having a discussion, and they'll be like, "Oh my God, I can't believe that they're not doing anything about climate change. Oh my God, I'm not going to eat GMOs." And I'm like, okay, so you'll accept the scientific, and so there's this agreement with the scientific consensus on topics that agree with your own confirmation bias. And I think that's one of the issues that we're facing. So it's not that people just blow off all science, they just like the science that supports their viewpoints. And that's kind of the opposite of the scientific method. And I think that that passion around that is a really important thing. And one of the images in the documentary that was kind of stuck in my mind was the director said to me, "How would you visually display the scientific method?" And I was like, wow, that's a really hard one to answer, and if you watch the movie, you'll see how they did it, which I thought was very well done. But a lot of these concepts are just like, I don't know, quote unquote DNA, but it's not how most people think. Most people don't think like a scientist. I think 6% of people, I saw some statistics, make their decisions based on evidence. The rest have other metrics that they use. Some of it will be evidence and who's presenting. So do I trust the messenger? That's a really important one. And then others, there's a conspiracy theory. There's all sorts of people, but only about that small number make their decisions based on science, which leads to the problems that we have. But yes, you did have your question.
One of the things that I'm most frustrated in our regulatory work is the provision in the new GMO bill, the provision that prohibits me from actually looking at a product and saying, you know, you can't put a non-GMO label on it because there is no GMO version. There is a provision that says that if a product is a non-GMO, if there's no GMO version, you can still label that product as non-GMO. And I find that very frustrating because that's where the misleading comes in, where you have a non-GMO water. I mean, I would love to see GMO water. That would be very interesting. But that's one of the provisions in this GE bill that was particularly hamstrings me as a regulator because it doesn't allow me to say, well, there is no GMO version of, say, for example, a milk product. Therefore, we can't label something that's non-GMO if there is no GMO version. I think that's a big legislative change.
Yeah, so the non-GMO labeling is particularly frustrating, and I think it is misleading, and that is against the law according to the FDA. They haven't chosen to act on that though, and so I wasn't aware that was actually in the regulatory language. That butterfly to me is kind of like an upside down crucifix to a religious person. It's like, it just infuriates me. And I think the fact that companies are paying to certify that their condoms are non-GMO is just like, it's just insane. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of this started with the RBST discussion, and they were very successful in that campaign. And a lot of the people that are kind of out there talking nastily about GMOs come from Jeremy Rifkin. There's like this pedigree of I don't know, activism. I guess, you know, you have your academic pedigree, like this activism pedigree, and it was a very successful strategy. And I think, you know, they targeted McDonald's not to accept the GMO potatoes, and McDonald's caved. Dannon is now offering non-GMO yogurt. And so these companies make these short-term market decisions to protect their brand or to increase market share without really acknowledging their impact on the long-term sustainability of our food supply. And that, to me, is a discussion that's not very clearly elaborated to the public, who are quite often buying products that go against their very own stated interests in protecting the environment. It's, you know, when I see someone drive up to Whole Foods in a Prius, I'm like, you're just confused.
Well, unfortunately, we're at overtime. So I really want to thank you for your presentation. It was really very interesting. And one of the things I got out of it is we're going to have a new voicemail greeting on our label review unit about that special place in hell. Thank you very much. Very much appreciated. And thank you for everyone that tuned in online, and be looking for another announcement for our next technical seminar. Thank you.